The back squat is a basic compound movement. The back squat has a couple of different variations within the variation of a squat. So we're going to talk about a couple of those variations and some things to keep an eye out for. Now, I am going to be using a barbell to demonstrate a lot of these suggestions, but again, you could always substitute a barbell with dumbbells by also just placing them either on your shoulders or, as you see me in some of the demonstration videos, kind of lean on your back. So in most squat variations, we want our feet to be about hip distance apart, okay? My general rule of thumb, or at least suggestion, is going to be take your hands and go ahead and place them directly in front of you on your hips, okay? And the reason I say that is if your feet are too narrow, look at how my legs are inside my hands. If your feet are too wide, look at how my feet are outside of those hands, okay? So when we use that as a little visual cue, we can see, all right, I don't need to be too narrow, I don't need to be too wide, we are hip distance. Now this is general, okay? When I am looking at your form feedback or your form videos, I'm able to see if you specifically do better with a wider stance or a more narrow stance. But generally speaking, squats are always going to start with your feet hip distance. The next cue is going to make sure that your toes are not necessarily pointed forward unless that's a specific variation, okay? Again, we're just talking about a standard squat, okay? So with our toes, we don't want to make sure that they are pointed forward. We want them to turn outwards about 30 to 45 degrees. Something to look for is going to be, first of all, making sure that your heels are planted on the ground. If your feet are too narrow, when you take that squat, your heels have no other choice but to rise. If your feet are too wide, when you take your squat, you're not going to be able to get as deep because usually what happens is a combination between a lack of hip mobility and your inner thigh being stretched to its maximum potential, it prevents us from getting deep into that squat. Whereas when our feet are hip distance and our toes are pointed at that 30 to 45 degree angle, our goal is going to be to get our glutes about the same height as our knees. So if you'll notice, it's about similar heights, and if you'll notice, my thighs are about parallel with the ground. My heels are also firmly planted on the ground. We want to make sure that our knees are tracking along our toe line. So what that means is as we take our squat, we're allowing our knees to open up wide and we are tracking along that toe line. Our knees are not more narrow, our knees are not more far apart, they are tracking along the toe line. So if you have your toes turned out and you are taking that squat and you're trying to keep your knees super close together and squatting, see how that's going to put a little bit too much pressure on the inside parts of your knees. You might even experience a sensation on the inside part of your knee, and that discomfort is a sign that something is off. When we take our back squat, as we squat down, because a lot of us don't have great hip mobility, our lower back is going to arch, it's going to hyperflex, and that's putting a lot of pressure on that lower back when if we were to tuck that pelvis, right? So tucking your pubic bone all the way up, pretending like there's a little string pointed to the ceiling, tucking that pelvis forward, and now here we're going to brace our core. So when we tuck the pelvis and we brace our core and we're maintaining that contraction on our core, it's almost impossible to let that back hyperflex. We are intentionally pushing against that resistance, okay? And so what that's going to do is prevent a lot of discomfort that you might feel when you're taking a back squat. Because if we have our weight on our back, and our lower back is hyperflexing, this is not controlling your center of gravity. Your center of gravity is in jeopardy. Whereas when we control our center of gravity and our center of gravity is strong, we have a better opportunity of, first of all, maintaining correct form, which is going to prevent injury, which is going to allow us to lift with maximum potential. And speaking of lifting with maximum potential, when your core is braced, it's helping you lift heavier compared to when your core is not braced. It's going to inhibit you from lifting as heavy as possible. Now notice what I'm not doing. I'm not standing up and thrusting my hips forward. So I'm not taking that squat and then squeezing my glutes all the way at the top, okay? First of all, there's no reason to do that, all right? A lot of times we have been taught, and I also used to believe this, that when we stand up, if we squeeze our glutes, we're engaging more glutes. When in reality, your glutes are doing nothing at the top of a squat. Your glutes are working at the bottom of a squat because see how they're stretched there, it's lengthened position, okay? So down here, if we were to hold a pause or two, you would get a little bit more glute engagement because we have time under tension at the bottom of a squat when your glutes are actually activated, all right? But at the top of a squat, there is no need to push your hips forward. In fact, what that's going to do is create way too much instability on your lumbar spine and your hip flexors in the front and the back. You're placing way too much tension by pushing those hips forward, okay? So there's no need to do that. In reality, we are just coming all the way down and we're coming all the way up. Now, occasionally, we will play around with a variation of a back squat with our heels elevated. Our ankle mobility will affect our ability to get as deep into our squat as possible. So if we have really tight ankles, we won't be able to squat down deep. And the deeper the squat, the more muscle recruitment and the more challenge we're placing on our body. Because when we leave range of motion on the table, we are not using our muscles to their true potential. And so a way to compensate for a lack of ankle mobility is going to be to raise your heels. Now, you see me raise my heels in many different ways, whether it's using tiny little dumbbells like you're seeing me show you here, or maybe you're standing on a plate. The point is that we're raising our heels, okay? So some trainers might give you a specific 20-degree incline, 30-degree incline. I just want you raising your heel. So don't worry about how high or how low. Now, it's perfectly normal to be worried about trying to prevent those knees from coming over those toes. The next time you're in front of a set of stairs, I want you to go up those set of stairs while trying to not let your knees go past your toe line. It's a simple exercise to show you there are many times in life where our knees naturally come past our toe line. And so when we're training for life, it would make sense that we're also using similar range of motion tactics. Another reason why you might see a heel raise is because some of us have different lengths of our femur, our thigh bone, okay? And that's going to matter because as we squat down, some of us can't help but to lean forward quite a bit, okay? On the flip side, some of us can't help but to remain upright a tiny little bit, okay? So I want you to pay attention to this. Watch the bar path as I take my squat. We are looking to keep that bar in alignment with your ankles, okay? So as we squat down, I'm trying to keep my body upright while not hyperflexing that lower back, and we're taking that squat and we're standing up. The reason this matters is if we are squatting down and we have our bar far away from our ankles, look at the gap in between that bar path and that ankle path, okay? The further away that bar from your lower back, from your center of gravity, the more pressure you're putting on your lower back, and therefore the greater risk of injury to your lower back. Sometimes we don't want that knee flexion that allows that knee to come past our toe line. Pay attention to my calf, okay? Look at how much of my calf is in a diagonal angle, all right? Look at the difference between here in that diagonal and what happens if I shift my weight back and now my now my calves are more at a vertical. And so if you see variations that say keeping your shins vertical, that's what I mean. This is way easier said than done, okay? So if you'll notice, if I try to keep my shins completely vertical, I can't really get down into a super low range of motion because they're breaking vertical. So that's why it's just really important to pay attention to those form cues and showing you that visual between less knee flexion is going to be a little bit more posterior chain and more glute engagement, and more knee flexion is going to be a little bit more quad engagement. The last thing that I want to point out is going to be the bar height, okay? There is a low bar position where, as you can tell, it is kind of in between my shoulder blades, and there is a high bar position, okay? When we are in a high bar position, we are mostly sitting that bar not on our neck forward, we are essentially sitting it on our shoulders. In a high bar position, our hands are going to be closer to our person. On a low bar position, our hands are going to be further away. And what you don't see me use in either of these is a hip thrust bar pad on your back squat. And the reason why is because that throws off the weight distribution and therefore throws off your center of gravity. So if the bar is hurting you, it's likely because you have it too high and it's resting on your neck bone. What we want to do is slightly drop it, and with our hands super close together, our hands are working simultaneously with our elbows. It's in a locked position, and that bar isn't going anywhere, and I'm also not hurting my neck. No need to use a hip thrust bar pad. Okay, so let's put it together. Feet are hip distance, toes are pointed out at that 30 to 45 degree angle. We're tucking that pelvis, we're bracing our core, and we're taking that squat. Our goal is to try to remain upright with that bar tracking on top of that ankle line. Maybe we want a little bit more quad engagement, or maybe we're having a really hard time not bending forward and we need to stay a little bit more upright to be a little bit easier on our lower back. Cool, we're raising our heels, same rule of thumb applies. Bar tracks along those ankle lines. Okay, we don't want as much quad engagement. We want a little bit more posterior chain with our glutes. Our core is braced, pelvis is tucked. We're trying to keep those shins as vertical as possible, sticking those glutes back, but don't forget, core is braced and pelvis is tucked. Bar is as close to on top of that ankle line as possible. And that's back squats 101.